Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here with us for the 7th annual RELX SDG Inspiration Day. For those of you who may not know, RELX is the parent company to Amsterdam-based Elsevier and New York-based LexisNexis. We provide science, technical, medical, and legal information. My name is Lily Kidder, and I'm delighted to introduce a very special group of distinguished guests with us today on behalf of our partnership with the United Nations Association New York. This partnership is a unique one in that it blends RELX's commitment to global science, health, and information analytics with UNA's expansive UN diplomatic community. As we are all aware, science is the process of pursuing answers, while diplomacy is the process for dialogue and cooperation between countries and citizens. One of the key priorities of this partnership is to explore the concept of health diplomacy and how it affects a nation's domestic and foreign policy across all levels of governance. The title of today's special lecture, inaugural lecture, is The Future of Global Health and the Role that Businesses Play in Advancing the SDGs with Science and Health Diplomacy. Moderating the panel today is my colleague from the UNA, Robin van Puyenbroeck, Executive Director from the World Trade Center Association. And before I turn it over to Robin, I'd like to give a special thanks to Executive Director Ms. Ann Nicol from the UN Association, who has worked tirelessly with me on many parts of this partnership. Thank you all for being here. And Robin, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Lily, for this warm introduction, and welcome everyone here to the Ban Ki-moon stage. So I'm Robin van Puyenbroeck, Executive Vice President of the United Nations Association of New York. And at UNA, as Lily was referring to, we seek to strengthen the UN system. We seek to promote constructive US leadership at the UN. And our focus is therefore also on creating awareness and action in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. And now that we see this post-pandemic world emerging, clues of disruptions that this new world of digital globalization will bring are visible. Inflation is rising, public debt levels are stratospheric, supply chains are being disrupted, leading to price increases and shortages from basic food staple medication to semiconductors. Also, the global trade infrastructure is yearning for reform to make global trade more inclusive so it can work for everyone. And in the midst of this greatest health crisis in a generation, it is far from over yet. So there's no more pertinent topic to discuss at this SDG Inspiration Day than the role of business in addressing global health. And relevant goals today are Goal 3, that is good health and well-being, and Goal 17 on partnerships for the goals. So we will be discussing the relationship between business and global health, the role of business as a force for good, but also the importance of good health for economic resilience. We could not have wished for a more expert panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I will briefly introduce each of the panelists, of our guests, and then give the floor to each for introductory remarks, after which we will start our discussion. So first, welcome to Oussama Malik, CEO of FOR, which is a next-generation targeted oncology biopharma. He is also the former Chief Innovation Officer and Strategy Officer at Pfizer, where he had instrumental roles driving innovation, including the development of new R&D models. Tremendous expertise on the health subject for sure, and coming from Pfizer, I am sure that he also will bring a lot of insights on the COVID-19 vaccine development. So again, welcome Oussama, and very much looking forward to your thoughts.
Thank you.
Welcome also Dimitri de Vreeze, Co-Chief Executive and Chief Operating Officer and a member of the Managing Board of Royal DSM. DSM is a purpose-led global science-based company in nutrition, health, and sustainable living. Dimitri, it's also good to see you again. This has been a while since we saw each other last in the Netherlands. And I will add that Dimitri, who is a great corporate leader, and also DSM, have been staunch supporters for many years of the work of the United Nations and the United Nations Association. And that DSM was recognized already in 2010 with the UN Humanitarian Award for its work on global health and nutrition. So again, welcome Dimitri. So good to have you with us as well for this important conversation.
My pleasure.
And last but not least, a warm welcome to Gabriela Cuevas Barron, co-chair of the UHC 2030 Committee, honorary president of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and a member of parliament at the Mexican Congress. So UHC 2030, and UHC stands for Universal Health Coverage, provides a multi-stakeholder platform to promote collaborative working at global and country levels on health system strengthening. They advocate for increased political commitment to universal health coverage and facilitate accountability and knowledge sharing. So it's also important to mention that Gabriela is a member of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. So needless to say that she is one of the most prominent health policymakers and advocates. Again, welcome Gabriela, and thank you for being here with us today. Now, I have already spoken too much, so let us get started. And Usama, let me turn it over to you for your introductory remarks.
Robin, thank you for that great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be part of this illustrious panel. I'm honored to be here today. Quickly on myself, thanks again for the introduction. I've been in the healthcare industry for a little over 20 years. I've been in management consulting and investment roles and in operational roles. I started out as a management consultant in the industry. I took leadership roles at Pfizer, and I've worked with multiple biotechs in executive roles in the public market. Prior to healthcare, I've also spent a lot of time in technology and telecoms in the 90s. And so the digitization of the world was an important part of that period that I was contributing to as well. And it's been an enormous journey over the last 30 years, looking at the evolution of the world as digital and physical have started to come together, and its specific implications on healthcare as well. I think in relation to today's topic, it is a broad topic, it's a complex topic. I have a lot of thoughts. I'll try and synthesize some of the topics that hopefully we can discuss over the course of this conversation. You know, business has evolved significantly since the Industrial Revolution, how we organize, how we produce, and how we distribute innovation and products and services. You know, on the bright side, if you look at the long stretch of history over the last 150 years, we've seen an enormous amount of progress for everyone. There's always inequality, there's always injustice, but I think overall humankind has made progress, and that's stated in the numbers. Life expectancy has grown by 2x over the last 150 years. Global population has quadrupled over the last 150 years. GDP has gone up by 30 times, 3,000% over the last 100 years or so. These are all seminal points to think about, and this has happened due to the organization of governments. This has happened due to the organization of civil society, and this has happened due to the organization of businesses and their contribution to innovation. Those are all positive characteristics of societies growing. There's always a dark side or a cynical side to all of this. At the same time, I think the organization of business and this acute focus on Milton Friedman's capitalism and how we measure productivity and how we measure the role of business has changed significantly. Just to give you an example, in the 40s and 50s, specifically in the US, but I think globally as well, businesses were very local. They were part of their communities. They engaged with labor. They gave back to their local communities. You know, you could go to a local bank and open a bank account because the bank manager knew your mother and you had a reputation in the neighborhood. And so there was this very local physical interaction between businesses and communities. We're getting more and more detached from that. We now have, you know, starting in the 80s with these massive corporate raiders coming in and creating large global institutions, we have these multinational companies that are bigger than countries. You know, they produce more income than GDP of lower income countries combined. And they wield an enormous amount of power without the governance and oversight that's required of these kinds of institutions. Now, I think government has a role to play in terms of how these models for large multinational companies operate moving forward and how they contribute and give back to society, in addition to making profits for their shareholders. At the same time, there is self-policing as well. You can see a lot of companies now focused on what was previously known as corporate social responsibility, but this ethos of purpose and purpose-driven companies. And I'm sure Dimitri will talk a little bit about this as well. But this whole notion of purpose and companies moving away from just focus on profits and generation of income to doing something bigger and more meaningful for their communities, for society at large, and taking some of that income and profit and reinvesting it to continue the innovation and the progress that's required equally across human societies. You take the role of foundations that large companies have. For example, my ex-employer Pfizer has a very large foundation that invests in a lot of civil society initiatives, local initiatives, distribution of vaccinations, distribution of medicines in lower and poor income societies. There is always an ethos for purpose and to give back. I think the balance has skewed over the last 30 or 40 years with an acute focus on hyper-capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, and an acute focus on income. But I think that balance is starting to shift back. If you look at people like the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, he talks about purpose-driven companies all the time now. He's acutely attuned to income inequality and the types of aberrations that can create in society moving forward. You talk about Ray Dalio, the CEO of Bridgewater, largest hedge fund in the world. He's acutely attuned into income inequality and the role and the purpose business has to play moving forward to ensure that justice and equality and purpose are also top of mind for these institutions. So there is some self-policing that's happening, and I think because of the positive impact of these conversations, other organizations are learning from it, but I don't think we're at the pace that we need to be at. Last thing I'll say in relation to healthcare specifically, I think the institutions and governance mechanisms that have been implemented over the last 40 or 50 years, and some of the new institutions have really catapulted the role of public health and disseminating quality and access across the globe. And I think the Millennium Development Goals, setting global standards and having goals, really, even if it's not at the pace that we would have liked it, has really impacted and shaped the view of what the role of society is. And so while we developed these goals decades ago, we're still talking about them, we're still working towards them, and we're aligning institutional incentives to make sure that we are making progress against these things. That's incredibly important, and I'm glad that we as a society came to that conclusion that we have to think ahead and we have to set goals that are common and allow societies to move forward. You take things like Gavi and the distribution of vaccines. These are public, private, civil society initiatives. You think of what the Clinton Foundation did or what Bill and Melinda Gates have done. They are aligning incentives between governments, between businesses, and between civil society to really tackle some of the toughest issues that exist in public health. You take Operation Warp Speed, which is really, a fascinating journey last year. The pace, the breakneck pace and speed with which we align our purpose and our incentives to create vaccines in 1 year. This is innovation at its best. Going from a virus that was spreading at breakneck speed to organizing scientists around the world to confer and come up with the best ideas, create the medicine, put it in tens of thousands of people around the world, generate data, and get enormous results. 90% plus efficacy is unheard of in vaccinations. We haven't had that before. Influenza vaccines are 50-60% effective at best. And look at this. We've essentially solved at least the first set of strains for COVID. And that could not have happened without the government setting frameworks and aligning incentives, the private sector innovating at breakneck pace, and civil society helping distribute these innovations so that all of us can benefit from it. So, I think as we progress the conversation here today, we can talk about all of these elements, how businesses have changed, the role of business and how purpose drives business moving forward, and what kind of frameworks governments can continue to create to align the incentives, not just with business, but also civil society, which is an important actor in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, very well said. I think it's where there's a will, there's a way. And the innovation that public-private partnerships have brought in this case are actually extraordinary. And I take away your points about changing demographics in combination with a redistribution of power, and how that has led more companies than ever before to be purpose-driven, which takes me to Dimitri. When we talk about a focus of purpose, I think DSM has always been a pioneer actually in this purpose-driven leadership. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dimitri, but DSM also stands for doing something meaningful, right? So I'll give the floor to you because I'm sure you have a lot of very interesting things to say about this notion also of purpose-driven leadership.
Yeah, thanks, Robin, and thanks for that introduction. And indeed, the interesting is that DSM, when we started 120 years ago, it was standing for Dutch State Minds. So could you imagine talking about transformation going forward? And you were saying if you put your minds to it, it can happen. The doing something meaningful DSM part was introduced by our younger DSM generation. Basically said, hey, this is why we like to work for DSM, because we feel we are contributing to doing something meaningful. And that is exactly changing the mindset of many of us, not only in the company, but also outside, and certainly the next generation. Talking about the next generation, that is certainly not me. Let me talk a little bit about myself. I'm a fossil at DSM, more than 30 years with DSM. I started with DSM just to do a bit of a traineeship and then move forward to other interesting companies. But here you go. I stayed with DSM more than 30 years. And you see where it could end up. I'm co-CEO of DSM since 1.5 to 2 years, together with my co-CEO, Geraldine Matchett. So very interesting to see that journey within DSM, and it continues. Like you said, we were one of the first companies who put very prominently out there that we are a purpose-led, performance-driven company. And we were being asked about, why will you do that? I mean, you're on earth to make money for your shareholders. And we said, no. We basically have a broader responsibility. And we do see that at DSM. And coming to your point, how does business play a role? We think that businesses have to play a huge role. And I think Usama also said it well. Some of the companies are bigger than GDP of some of the countries. So I think the private business environment has to create an environment where they take responsibility for what they did. And I think COVID has been a perfect test to see if the combination of public-private partnership works. But that's under an emergency and a stress situation. And my call for action is that we keep that momentum to address other issues in the world. Because after COVID, we have other issues to combat, like climate change, like hunger. I mean, you mentioned it, I think SDG number 2 is zero hunger. It's still out there. We need to solve it. There's no reason that we cannot solve it if we work together. It is ridiculous that we have as many people malnourished as people being obese. We can solve these issues if we bring things together. And I'm fully echoing what Usama was saying. Governments need to set the pace, the boundaries, the laws, the requirements, and the businesses need to do their best within these restrictions to take everything it got to solve these problems and do that in nice cooperation. And I think that is what DSM stands for. It's one of the reasons why the younger generation said, hey, we work for DSM to do something meaningful. Important is that it starts with the notice of capabilities. And I think many of our companies see that there are huge capabilities, vaccine development, but in our space, nutrition, create health for people and for planet. And if you have that capability, you also have a responsibility, not only to make money, but also to create a brighter life. And we feel that between now and maybe 5 or 10 years, companies will be viewed differently. Today, if we look at the annual reports of companies, which normally are 200 pages, the financial figures are being audited, fully audited and double audited. The planet and people figures, so your greenhouse gas emissions, your scope 1, how are you doing on child labor? What is the emissions on scope 3? What is your engagement survey? Those are maximum audited as being what they call reasonable assured. So already in the word, right? Reasonable assured. So if you think about people, planet, profit, the profit numbers are maximum assured. Could you imagine that we go out there as DSM and say, hey, all our numbers are reasonably assured, also for our profit and loss and our revenues? I think nobody will accept it. What the world does accept is that the greenhouse gas emissions, which we report, are maximum reasonably assured. I think the world will expect these companies to be as transparent that people, planet, and profit will be maximum assured for the future. And you see already audit firms preparing for that. And I think that is good news, because for us, we feel, and we call it holistic P&L, and holistic profit and loss, which encompasses people, planet, and profit contribution. And then you have a net contribution or you have a negative contribution. Could you imagine companies who have a fantastic score on people, a fantastic score on planet, but they make loss? That is not a sustainable company. That will not exist. However, if you have a company who made huge profits and is very good for their people, but they're destroying the planet, that's not a sustainable company either. The other example is very good for planet, making huge profit, but it's bad on their people. That is not sustainable either. So we feel that the real champions in the business are companies who think people, planet, profit, and score on all three. And that is moving towards a people, planet, holistic P&L. And the beauty is that within DSM, we're trying a bit the boundaries. We have, for instance, our remuneration is 50% finance related, 50% non-financial. Our shareholders initially said, well, why is that the case? It's because longer term, you need to think triple P, people, planet, profit, going forward. And I think that is something which we need to take in mind if we look at the responsibility of companies looking forward. Therefore, for us, the link to SDGs is almost as logic as you can see. The only thing is, what I'm strongly advocating for is that the strategy for the world, which is covered by the SDGs, is being pronounced and used a bit more prominently. In the Netherlands now, we are teaming up with the Dutch multinationals, AXO, Shell, Unilever. Well, Unilever is no longer a Dutch multinational, but anyway, we still try to influence them to report in our annual report how we contribute to the SDGs. And the beauty is that we're all on board. And within DSM, we're also trying to do that. It is in the sort of a learning phase, and we are progressing, but it makes huge sense. For us, it's SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, good health, and SDG 13, climate action, because they fit in where we stand for as a strategy. To the point, how is responsible care, how is sustainability talked about? Usama was talking about it. It's normally corporate social responsibility. I dare to say that if there's a company who has a corporate social responsible care department, it means it's not being embedded in the company. It is a nice add-on or a requirement. It is not. I call them, these companies will be the dinosaurs of the future. Well, we already have no dinosaurs today, so we will certainly not have dinosaurs for the future. So the companies who do not adapt will be the dinosaurs of the future. So with DSM being there for 120 years, we try to avoid being a dinosaur of the future. And I think we'll do so far a nice job, but we're not there yet. We need to progress. And therefore, with all the complexity of the problems, Usama said it on the COVID, with the technology and the science level in the world, at companies, at universities, as governments, at startups, at venturing, if we bundle that together, there is no reason that we cannot improve rapidly on many of the SDGs being formulated. And that's my plea to everybody out there. Companies, take your responsibilities. Governments, set consistent frameworks so that the businesses can play in that sandbox. And if we do that well in a collaborative way, magic can happen. And COVID was a nice example that magic can happen.
Dimitri, I could not agree more that that magic can happen, and I think it's also a notion you mentioned it, that as a company or as any organization, either you will be disrupted or you become the disruptor. And on sort of the people, planet, profit, what you were talking about, I had this conversation earlier with Professor Roberto Ribogon from MIT, and he has a very interesting thesis about measurement and how we measure things and how we end up measuring all the wrong things in the world. And then we make decisions based on bad information, where he would say that we measure the stock market on a per second, millisecond basis, but we don't measure anything to do with happiness. Even GDP numbers are a year delayed, but yet we make very important decisions on that information. So this sort of also takes me to the public-private partnership notion to you, Gabriela, when we talk about being purpose-driven and doing something meaningful. So that, of course, also translates very much in the role of government, and we'd love to hear from you and your role also as an elected official and the role of government as a policymaker in this conversation. So I'll hand it right over to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the 2030 agenda is bringing us an ambitious and challenging set of commitments that we need to deliver, but we also need to put all the different pieces together. I mean, from one side, we have the United Nations and the different governments agreeing in this agenda. But on the other hand, we need a lot of different constituencies, a lot of different stakeholders to translate these global commitments into national proposals at least, but I think that it has to go even to the local solutions, to the community level. And I think that's why politicians should be also part of this conversation, because yes, at the government level, there is the part of the, well, I must say the state level, because there's the side of the government who is developing a lot of policies, executing budget, a lot of things. But on the other hand, we have, for example, the parliamentarians. And I think that I have been a parliamentarian almost all my life, so I must bring parliamentarians to the table, because I think that at the end, our nature is to be people's representatives. And that includes businesses, that includes local communities, that includes the national policies. As parliamentarians, we have different responsibilities. One of them is the national legislation. Dimitri was talking about that. We need to set the rules. And those rules are made for certainty, for understanding how we can coincide at the public space with each other. Those are the rules, and we have to commit to those rules. That's why rule of law is important for business, but for peace, but for development, but for everything. There's another important task, which I think could be probably the most important one, even that sometimes as parliamentarians, we are not really aware of that. And that's budget. We are responsible of the most important public policy instrument at the national level. When the government is usually proposing the first draft for the budget to Parliament, that reflects the government's priorities. But that instrument, the budget, goes to the Parliament because it has to be a plural and inclusive decision. And that means to have the different parts of the territory, but also the different political expressions, gender, age, ethnic groups, etc. So if something is not reflected in budget, that's really not a priority. That's political narrative. Then we have accountability, which I believe is also a very important mandate. We need to understand that it is not a trade-off between collaboration or fighting against the government. Yes, we can be an amazing opposition, or we can be the best supporters of the government. But accountability is about transparency. It's about delivering results and having accurate information. And of course, there are a lot of different things that parliamentarians must be doing, but we need to understand that nature of a representative body. And that includes bringing businesses to the table. We cannot continue with the same model that politicians are in one side of the table and the private sector is a different one. What I really like about UHC 2030's structure is that we are bringing different stakeholders to the table. We have the governments, we have the businesses, we have civil society, and we are creating that dialogue. And that dialogue has to be reflected at the national level. Again, it is not about private or public side. It's about bringing and building a different way of partnerships. The other part that I would like to address is how this influence health and concretely SDG 3. Well, yes, we are in the, someone saying that we are just getting out of the pandemic. I'm not sure, perhaps because I'm from Latin America and we are receiving like everything later. But we are in the pandemic and we are struggling with that. And we need to learn the lessons from it. We have a health crisis, an economic crisis, a climate crisis, and I would say also a gender crisis, because gender-based violence is growing everywhere. So we have a lot of different issues that we need to attend. And if we go to the numbers, we are not improving. We are going backwards because the pandemic moved us backwards. So we need to make an extra effort. We need to bring all the different stakeholders to the table and understand that first, there's no economic recovery if there's no health. We need healthy societies. We need also to understand that a lot of, a majority of those people that died with this pandemic, it's because they didn't have proper access to health, to good hospitals, or to access to medicines, or even to community level healthcare. So that has been really unfair, because what is deciding between life or death? It's mostly money or family income. And that cannot continue. We need to change that reality. So that's why we are also advocating for universal health coverage. Not from now, we have been doing that for a long time. It's part of SDGs, it's SDG 3, but we need to understand that healthy societies are the only ones that are going to be able to have an economic recovery and to have, for example, real changes on the energy policies. So in general, I think that my time is almost over. I do believe in partnerships. I have been a politician all my life, but I understand that you cannot make an economic change with a political or parliamentary decree. We need to work together for implementation processes. We need to work together to translate international commitments into national and local realities. So thank you very much for the invitation and having this, I think, very interesting dialogue.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gabriela. And I have to say, you start off talking about budget. And I think the key is really in budget, because budget is all about making choices, right? And then allocating resources accordingly, and that is a matter for private companies as much as for the government. But of course, what the government has, what you have as a representative of people, is that convening power. I think as a government can convene, but it can also set, as Dimitri was alluding to, the sandbox, set out the regulations for everybody to play with. So you also mentioned accountability and transparency. So with that, I want to sort of take it to you, Dimitri, the relationship between business and public health. So what is that relationship? And especially also thinking about the accountability factor there. Do businesses have to be accountable for global health, for public health? Do they have a role to play there?
Yeah, absolutely key question, and thanks for asking, because I really think that companies do have a responsibility. They cannot back off on that responsibility, and they cannot just take responsibility where it suits them. You cannot be selective on public health. You cannot say, okay, I'm only feeling responsible that part and not feeling responsible for the other part. You have a joint responsibility to play, and the only thing is, where can you contribute? So and I'm coming back to my earlier statement, that there where you have a capability, you also have a responsibility. So for instance, if I come back to what we see at DSM on the health trends, we see 3 interesting trends happening today and maybe accelerated today. One is that the consumer is today more concerned about their health than ever before. Not only during COVID, but also post-COVID. We see, for instance, in Asia, that people remain worried about their immune system. So health is on top of mind. 65% of the people we have interviewed of a big sample basically say that one of their major concerns is their health. So therefore, I think businesses, together with governments, have a role to play. Secondly, we see that society at large, and I think Gabriela was looking at it from a budget perspective, we have an issue with healthcare costs. If it continues as is, it cannot be financed. So we need to change from solutions of people being ill to prevention. And there is a bit of a dilemma, because prevention itself remains a change of behavior. But the costs which you put into prevention basically are multiple times lower than if you go into solutions. So if you're in the hospital, then the costs are being multiplied with 10. If you have a healthy lifestyle and you can prevent becoming ill, that is something we should work on. And I think society, and I think Gabriela was talking about it, that sandbox, the requirements need to put in place. So society is also playing a role. Then the third one is the environmental bit. Sometimes on the health pace, we forget that. But with global population growth, food security is a key issue. And today, food supply is growing at the cost of the planet. It needs to be within the planet boundaries. Otherwise, we erode on the planet. So consumers, society, environment, issues do play a role, and companies do have a role to play together with the governments, but also with the consumers. We sometimes forget the consumers, like you and me are buying products. We should demand transparency on how healthy is this? Healthy for the people, health for the planet. So consumer, society, and environmental things need to come together, and therefore we feel that we have an important role to play. Consumers for immunity, society for healthcare costs, and environment because of, we call that sustainable farming, health for people and health for planet. Let me give you a small example where it's important, where we all play our role. We at DSM, we have developed a fantastic additive to reduce methane at cows, etc. Well, forget about it's not a public advertisement campaign, but it'll show you a little bit the dynamics. If you add that to the premix of feed for cows, you reduce the methane emission at the cows with 30%. That's a huge breakthrough, scientifically backed up, right? The only thing is that someone needs to pay for it. So we went to the farmer and we said to the farmer, you have a problem because your cows are emitting methane. If you add our additive to it, you reduce with 30%. Then the farmer said, well, thank you very much, dear DSM, but I don't have a problem because the emission of methane is costing me nothing. And I'm pretty sure that the additive you want to sell me, it has a price. They say, yeah, that's true. So we said, okay, then we go to the governments. We said to the governments, you have an emission of methane problem, right? And we have a solution. And then the government said, oh, fantastic that you have this solution, but you need to agree that with the farmer and they need to pay for it. They say, yeah, but we've just been there. And they said, okay, oh, that's a problem. So we basically are today into a consortium where governments together with farmers and private business together say, hey, listen, if methane emissions is bad for the planet, it needs to have a price. It needs to have a cost. If it has a cost, you can accelerate innovation and adoption in the chain. And I think we've done that with CO2 pricing. In Europe, the carbon price today is 50 euros a ton. And that creates a huge innovation. And therefore, we do see innovation coming. So coming back to the point, do we have a role to play? Absolutely. But we also need the governments to set the boundaries on the society today is almost like a free cost waste interaction. You can throw away your carpets for zero. It is eroding the planet. It should have a huge price. If it has a price, innovation will start where we as private business have to play. And I was a bit pessimistic 5 years ago, but I see an enormous acceleration of that joint collaboration where we really can do breakthrough things, not only in sustainable farming, but also immunity improving healthcare solutions.
Yeah, I think very, very well said, Dimitri, about the role of business here. So you did mention, of course, now this triangle, the partnership with the government. So I'll jump quickly back to you, Gabriela, on how as a policymaker, like in this scenario, what Dimitri, this example he was giving, how can you then impact global public health, because again, a lot of politics is still at the very local or national level at best. There is the more multilateral type of environment as well. But so how can you as a policymaker, as an elected official, how can you make the greatest impact in also, you know, doing your part from the public sector's view in making these changes happen?
There are different levels of action. If we learn also the lessons at the multilateral level, there's a lot of things that we have to do. There's like I think a very strong agreement that we need to strengthen WHO. That's clear. If we see the first response of the countries with the pandemic, it was closing borders and people were going to the supermarket for toilet paper. So we need to change that dynamics and go back to collaboration, to more cooperation. It's about, I think, almost basic stuff like exchanging data, having reliable data, having joint procedures in terms of research and development. I think that, yes, the pharmaceutical industry and some governments had a very interesting cooperation, but it was not enough. I think that if we take a look to what's happening, for example, in Africa or some developing countries that are just starting to receive some vaccines, we are failing. At the end, we're failing because we are not acting as one single humanity. And that goes for climate change, that goes to zero hunger. It's about cooperation. It's about understanding that there's interdependence that we need to address and to acknowledge. There's also the national and local level. We do have a kind of a roadmap with SDGs, and we have a comprehensive idea on what UHC, universal health coverage, must look like. But when it comes to the national level, you have to design a tailor-made solution. And that goes to how are we going to address health as a human right? In some countries, health is not recognized as a human right for all. And some countries where living immigrants or refugees or different ethnic groups aside of all health policies. So that cannot be repeated. So it's about human rights. It's about policy making. It's about recognizing all the different parts of a stronger health system that goes from the national level and highly specialized policies to the community-based health services. And of course, as Dimitri was pointing out, we need prevention. We need to understand that some of those causes are part of our food systems or are part of our agricultural systems. So we need also to do that part. I think that the public sector, the government or the parliamentarians have a lot of things to do here because we need to set the rules. We need to decide the priorities that are going to be reflected in budget. We need to understand that health is a priority. Only to close, but if we don't do that, if we don't understand that UHC must be a priority, by year 2030, half of the world's population is going to be out of the health system. That is about 5 billion people without access to health. That cannot happen. If we imagine what could happen with 5 billion people outside of the health system, and for example, if we have another pandemic or something, that could be a disaster. So we need to change how are we seeing health, and that has to be translated to a real priority for governments and of course an inclusive policy with other stakeholders.
Yeah, it's incredible if you look at the numbers. They're staggering. So we better hope that Dimitri is right, that magic can still happen. But I want to take this to you, Usama, because you know, coming of your experience working in the sector, in the development, you know, we've witnessed this huge role for the private sector in vaccine development, and it was, you're right, an incredible exercise there to at record speed come up with this vaccine. Can you share some thoughts there on sort of how that all came about, and also to what Gabriela was talking about, prevention here. So what can be done from your perspective in preventing a similar crisis like this and preventing a larger global health crisis, as Gabriela was referring to in general, that so many people would actually be outside of the healthcare system?
Yeah. So let me structure this in a few ways. I think if we take the example, and Dimitri set this up perfectly, it was under duress last year that we made such breakthrough change, and ultimately the incentives were aligned. If you take capitalism at its barest form, it is ultimately about incentives and constraints. And I think while there's a lot of optimism in this conversation about the partnership between the public sector and the private sector, it is a loose partnership. And I think these bonds need to be strengthened further, and there needs to be more accountability between the public sector and the private sector. If governments can create stronger frameworks and clearer outcomes that they want to achieve, and thereby incentivize the private sector to try and solve those problems, private sector always does step up to the plate then. What happened last year was under duress, and we knew that the economies were collapsing, people were dying, and something needed to be done. Governments came together either individually or as collectives, and they started to put frameworks together in terms of incentivizing from an economic perspective, from a distribution perspective, from a speed perspective, and then the companies were then held accountable within that framework to deliver. So whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about health access, whether we're talking about the dignity of labor, whatever issues and topics that we deem important for the productivity of societies, we have to start getting more clear and accountable at a public policy level, and then enable the private sector to play that role. I think in relation to looking to the forward and future potential health catastrophes, I think Gabriela, to a large extent, covered this. I think collaboration, information sharing, and lowering the boundaries for institutions to be able to exchange and stay ahead of these things is incredibly important. In our last administration here in the US, we actually took an entire institutional infrastructure that was focused on looking at epidemics and pandemics, right? Forecasting, looking at it and trying to solve those problems, and we disintegrated that in entire institutional infrastructure. And so when COVID hit us, we were entirely unprepared. We were unprepared within the country, and we were unprepared to link and share with other countries. So when we think about future, again, pandemics, we have to create the institutional infrastructures, both at the public and the private sector level. And then there has to be an enormous amount of collaboration and information sharing that needs to happen. Data is everything today, and we're generating data, at a pace, at a breakneck pace that we've never seen. And each day that pace is quadruple the day before. But the ability to share and understand this data and then make decisions within institutional frameworks is incredibly important. We're not there today. I think it's a patchwork of local institutions. It's a patchwork of either private sector groups, civil society groups, or public groups that are incrementally looking at these things. But we really haven't come together as a collective, as a society or civilization, and said, again, what are the big things that we want to accomplish, and what are the risks that are ahead of us? How do we manage and incentivize the public sector, the private sector, and civil society to address the biggest goals that create productivity and happiness in society on the one hand, and what are the critical risks for every step that we take that will occur, and how do we manage those risks? And then create the institutional frameworks around those to share information and then make progress in those things. I know these are generalized statements and we can get into the specifics of it, but really I think from a framework perspective, that's how I would think about it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Osama. Like the data is critical. We just mentioned earlier about measuring, and the key to measuring in order to make decisions is have the right data. So this is extremely interesting. We do have like a few minutes left, unfortunately, but I have a question for each of you for like a 1 minute answer if you can. And Osama, I'll stay with you. It's really about maybe a more personal question, like how has the pandemic affected you personally? And so what was your experience also in relation to the work that you do, and sort of what do you think has permanently, if anything, changed because of the pandemic?
Well, I actually had COVID last year. So not only was it the isolation of the pandemic, but actually having gone through the disease. Listen, I don't have anything magical to say here. I think it was an incredibly tough year for all of us. I think isolation, social distancing in its ultimate form, where you're disconnected from friends, family, and society, these are almost things that are antithetical to human nature. And it creates a lot of anxiety within oneself. We're seeing rates of depression go up. We're seeing rates of productivity decline. We're seeing families fall apart. Relationships have been tough. Raising children at home, when they're schooling on Zoom, and you're a working mom or working father, and having to deal with that. It really, in many ways, showed and exposed how weak societies and communities can be when you're hit with such a catastrophic event. On the one hand. On the other hand, for every underbelly, there's a lot of optimism and opportunity. I think, for example, the role of digital really catapulted over the course of the last year. The fact that we're doing this conference that was, once done in person and we could have shaken hands, and we're doing it, from the comfort of our homes. As a CEO now, how I thought about this 5 years ago is very different from how I think about it now. I think the integration of people's personal lives, their families, their livelihoods, and how they want to operate is much more front and center for me. To be able to think about that and have more empathy for how people want to work, and not impose sort of structural top-down rules in terms of how work should happen. Ultimately, we're trying to achieve outcomes, and if we can achieve them in the best way, in the happiest way, in the most productive ways that work for each one of us individually, I think that's a big leap. And you're seeing this in large institutions, from Goldman Sachs to JP Morgan to Pfizer, right? Everyone has shifted their thinking on what work means and how you can actually be productive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that the work-life balance has definitely shifted, and people redefine their pursuit of happiness. So, Gabriela, same question: how has this pandemic really impacted you, and what do you think has permanently, if anything, shifted?
I think a lot of issues are going to change in our lives, in our communities, in our countries, and perhaps at the international level. I had to change from a different job. I used to be president of the Interparliamentary Union, and I used to be a very active president. I was traveling a lot. I do believe in national implementation. So the only way to really dream about changing the world is how you convince governments, how you convince parliaments to do their part, regardless of their political circumstances or budgetary restrictions. You have to go after them and to tell them that they need to do their part to change the world. And with the pandemic, everything changed. Now we are like more isolated, but not only in terms of the confinement or restrictions personally, but also in terms of the way that we can communicate, we can interact with other different cultures, or even traveling seems a part of that interaction, of getting to know each other in terms of how we can have empathy through a Zoom meeting, for example. That's very challenging. How we can build different understandings among people that are speaking different languages and are coming from different backgrounds. How do you bring all that plurality to a common ground? I think that was part of the challenges. And of course, I think that personally, I am Mexican. We love to be hugging each other. We are kissing people. We love our families. And even that my country didn't have a lot of restrictions, of course, the consequences were awful. We have lost a lot of people. We are not sure about the magnitude of the pandemic here. And I think that the lessons are still there. So the real challenge is going to be if we're going to be able to learn from the pandemic personally and as humanity, or if we are going back to business as usual and we lose a very important and perhaps tragic, but opportunity at the end to improve our lives.
Yeah, very well said. About let's see whether we go back to the old normal or we've learned a lesson here. So Dimitri, to you to end this great session here, like same question: what was the impact on you, and what, if anything, has permanently change, you think?
Yeah, I have to be honest, for me it was a difficult time because I mean, Gabriela is Mexican, although I'm Dutch, I've lived for a long time in Italy. And the Italians, they communicate via hands and hugging and talking and making noise and disagreeing with them. So I tried it on Teams, but it doesn't work. It doesn't come across, right? Although I have to say, I think the whole community learned how to communicate via Teams, because if we would have done this a year ago, we wouldn't have this passionate interaction. So I think we've also learned to adapt. So very good to see that we can have this intense conversation even via Teams. But I'm a strong promoter of connecting, get close, intensity, getting there. So I found it very difficult, but I try to adopt. In all fairness, to the other extreme, as being CEO, I sometimes did weird things by having a New York breakfast meeting. So flying from Amsterdam to New York, having a breakfast meeting and then flying back, right? I think in today's world, if you look at that, is that, are you nuts? I mean, that's not going to happen. I mean, that's not going to work anymore. And I think rightfully so. And then last but not least, within our company, and we are a company who produces stuff, right? Bioscience, bio-based, fermentation, safety is absolutely key. We want to create a safe working place for all of our employees. We have added, after the COVID pandemic, the health part. Not that it was not important, but it was more important during the COVID, and it will remain important after COVID. We have what we call life-saving rules, and we're also going to create health-improving rules. And that has to do with hybrid working, that has to do with working off-site, off-screen, being safe and healthy going forward. And obviously you could expect that if you are in the health business, you need to take care of not only your partners and your consumers, but also your employees. So that has changed and will change quite a bit. But in all fairness, I'm happy that hopefully it opens up a little bit, because my biggest concern, if this continues, is that many of the companies will lose the soul of the company. Because the soul of the company is built via human interaction, partly via Teams, but predominantly also because they meet, they interact. And I'm worried that if it takes longer than this 1 to 1.5 years, that the soul of the company will be eroded. But hey, I'm optimistic. So I basically think that we can create some magic, and that we can build on the soul of the company and base soul of partnerships in the private-public space as well. And with that, Robin, that is basically what I take home from the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're all 4 of us here eternal optimists, and that's a good thing. So sadly, our time is up. Thank you so much, Usama, Dimitri, Gabriela, for sharing so generously here. I think there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I think it's very important for people in the audience and in the world to hear and see and understand that the expertise and dedication that you all bring to the table in addressing these issues of global health. And I want to recognize the role of partnerships between business and government, and also your commitment in making the world a better and healthier place for everyone. So we said the word magic, so let's make more magic happen to deliver universal health coverage and true accountability for all actors. So thank you again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and to meet in person as soon as we have a chance to. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Honor and pleasure. Thank you, Robin.